What happens when a quiet woman is thrown out of her family like an inconvenient suitcase at an old station? She doesn't ask. She doesn't scream. She doesn't accuse. But what happens next turns everything upside down in the most unexpected way. Mateo woke up before dawn, not because he had to, but because he couldn't help it. His body knew what it had to do. His joints creaked like an old door, and without turning on the light, he shuffled into the kitchen as usual. The house was quiet. It had always been that way, even when someone lived there. The kitchen smelled of warm wood, the stove, and yeast. He had put the bread out the night before, not for anyone in particular, just because that was the way it was. There had to be bread. Mateo carefully removed the towel. The loaf had turned out well, with a slightly cracked crust. He took a knife and ran it around the edge. One slice for one plate, the second for the other, although he always ate alone. But he set two plates. Next to them were two mugs. He poured tea into one, strong and bitter, as usual. He filled the second one and placed it opposite. No one came. No one had come for many years. But the cup remained. It was just easier that way. As if there was still someone to say, "Sit down, eat while it's warm." He sat down. He ate silently, without rushing. He stared at the spot where she used to sit. Sometimes it seemed to him that if he didn't blink, he could make out her outline. As if she were there, only silent. When he finished eating, he got up and cleared the table. He wrapped the leftover bread in a towel, rinsed the cup, and put it away in the cupboard. As always, as if someone would appreciate his neatness. And then, a whistle. A train. Mateo shuddered. It had been a long time since there had been trains. They rushed by, loud and foreign, like everything that had happened in recent years. But this one was slowing down. The screech of metal on the rails, a rumbling sound, as if time itself were creaking. He stepped out onto the porch. The sun had not yet risen, but the sky was already beginning to brighten. The train was standing on the embankment further down the road, and next to it was a person, a woman, alone. Mateo noticed right away. She wasn't screaming or waving her arms. She was just standing there. She was holding a basket to her shoulder, like a child holding something she couldn't lose. Her hair was disheveled. Her coat was someone else's, clearly taken from someone's shoulder. Her eyes were large, as if the wind was stuck in them. He didn't ask who she was. He didn't call out to her. He just stared. And she stood there. There was something disturbing and very familiar about her, like an empty chair across from you. She just stood there by the embankment, with a basket and a face that no longer believed in warmth. He didn't ask her name or where she was from. And then something happened that changed them both. Something that reopened an old wound that Mateo had come to consider a scar. We've only just begun this story, but it will go deeper, much deeper. Stay tuned to find out what happens when strangers become closer than family. Clara woke up before everyone else. It was an unspoken rule in their house. If you want to go unnoticed, be the first one in the kitchen. Then there's a chance that the morning will start with silence instead of reproaches. She washed the sink without turning on the light. Her fingers already knew where the crack in the enamel bowl was, where the faucet dripped. The kettle was boiling on the stove. Elena came out as always, barefoot, with her hair uncombed and the heavy look of someone who had once again been misunderstood. She sat down at the table. She didn't say anything. Clara put a cup in front of her and added 2 slices of bread. No butter. She knew Elena didn't like it. "You're acting like a maid again," Elena muttered, without even looking up. "No one pays you for this." Clara smiled slightly. "I just wanted the morning to be peaceful." "You always just want things, and then they wipe you out like a floor rag." Elena pushed the mug away. "You're too soft." That's why they walk all over you. Clara didn't answer. She took a sip of tea and felt a lump in her throat. It wasn't from hurt. It was because somewhere deep down she agreed. Because in her entire life she had never been able to prove otherwise. Her softness had often become an excuse for other people's cruelty. On the wall above the old chest of drawers hung a photograph. It was yellowed. It showed her mother, still young, in a dress with a collar, and 2 girls. Clara remembered that day. She had a fever, but her mother took them to the photo studio anyway. She said they had to look like a family. And then she spent the whole evening scolding her for the dark circles under her eyes in the picture. She said she had ruined the shot. This photograph was like everything else in this house. Beautiful on the outside, but with pain beneath the glass. Clara glanced at it. And, as always, she thought, what if I didn't ruin it after all? What if I just wasn't the right child? In the other room, an old clock ticked. The hands barely moved, as if afraid of making a mistake. Clara was afraid too. Not of time, but of being inconvenient again. And yet, every day she made tea. Every day she cut bread. Because without it, the house felt completely empty. And this way, at least there was some sound, even if it was a reproach. Sometimes you are told so many times that you are unnecessary that you start to believe it. But everything changes when you are left alone. When the train leaves and there is no one around. This is the climax. Everything you've been waiting for is right here. Stay to see how Clara went beyond other people's expectations and looked at herself in the mirror for the first time. Clara lived in this house like a hotel with an expired reservation. Formally, she lived with her sister. In reality, she lived in a corner between the dryer and an old chest of drawers. She didn't have her own room, just a cot covered with a blanket that Elena called Grandma's old taste. That's where she slept, on the edge of life. When Clara first returned after everything that had happened, her sister said, "You can stay for a while, until you figure out where to go next." More than a year had passed. Clara hadn't gone anywhere, and she hadn't figured it out. Because every time she was about to leave, something stopped her. A broken kettle, an old neighbor with high blood pressure, her nephew's sudden cold. They seemed like trifles, but they stuck to her like wet leaves to a shoe. Elena worked as a nurse. She worked shifts, came home angry, always sleep-deprived. There was no room for sentimentality in her world. She lived by the principle, no one will save you if you don't save yourself. But Clara didn't ask to be saved. She asked not to be pushed. And yet, every evening Elena came home and let loose. Sometimes it was in the form of a sarcastic comment. "I wonder what you were doing today, thinking about life, staring at the ceiling." Sometimes it was in silence, the hardest kind. When 2 grown women sit at the table, but the silence between them is thicker than porridge, and you no longer know whether the fork is clattering with anger or just with age. There was no swearing in this house. They took offense quietly, as only those who have known each other for too long can do. Her nephew Daniil was a schoolboy. He was withdrawn, with dull eyes and perpetually slumped shoulders. Clara liked him. He was quiet, too. Sometimes they watched old movies together, and he would suddenly ask, "Do you believe that people can be good?" Clara answered evasively, because, to be honest, she didn't know anymore. There was also a cat. Black as a forgotten frying pan with a chopped-off ear. Clara had picked him up. She named him Tenyok. Elena snorted. "Of course, even your cat is defective, just like its owner. But every evening Tenyok would lie down at Clara's feet. He would keep her warm. He would be silent. And perhaps that was the only form of love that required no proof. Life was simple. Porridge in the morning, tea in the evening. Sometimes sandwiches. Sometimes just water and bread. Elena rarely left any money. She said, I'm not an ATM. You're a grown woman. Be kind and start living like one. Clara tried. She sewed things to order. She tended to her neighbors' houseplants. She took clothes to be recycled. She counted every penny. But every time she had a chance to earn money, something happened. Her ward died, a client left, or the goods were ruined. There were days when she wanted to disappear, but there was nowhere to go. She was left with one room, a blanket, and tiempo. One evening, when the wind was blowing against the window frames and the tea was bitter, Elena suddenly said, "Danilo and I are leaving." Clara looked up. "Where?" "To the city. To mine." "I got a job at a clinic. Consider yourself lucky." "We're not taking you with us." Silence thickened. Even the cat raised its head. Elena finished her tea and added, "Don't be offended. It's just, I need to live. I'm tired of your lethargy. You're always on tiptoes, as if you're afraid of disturbing someone." Clara didn't answer. She just got up and went to wash the cups. Her hands were shaking, not from anger but from recognition. This wasn't the first time. She had already been kicked out before, only now it sounded a little more polite. When she went to bed, Tenok came and lay down next to her. Clara stroked him, pressed her forehead against his warm fur and whispered, "It's okay, baby." "They've kicked us out before. We know how it is." The train left quickly, too quickly, as if it was afraid of changing its mind. Clara stood on the platform with a bag that contained nothing important, a couple of blouses, a comb, a can of condensed milk, which she had taken for some reason, perhaps just so that there would be something sweet about this departure. Elena and Danil were the first to board. They didn't even turn around. Only when the train had already started moving did Clara catch her sister's gaze through the window. Tired, irritated like a cashier who had finished her shift and didn't want to serve anyone else, she waved to them. Just because that's what you do, not out of hope, out of politeness. When the car disappeared, only she and a raven perched on the exit sign remained on the platform. The bird cawed loudly, as if commenting on everything that had happened. Clara sat down on a bench. The wind tugged at the hem of her coat. The bench was cold and hard, like the lives of those who are not expected. The station building smelled of mice and dust. The small ticket office window was closed. The coffee machine was dead. There was not a soul around. Only cobwebs hung from the ceiling, and the silence rang like in a temple. Clara slowly walked along the building. Around the corner, she saw an old cart with boxes and a paper wrapper that the wind was blowing across the asphalt, as if mocking her only luggage. "Can I help you?" A voice came unexpectedly. It was the station attendant. He wore a baseball cap. His eyes were dull, and his face was lined with wrinkles. Clara shook her head. "They've already left," she said. "Just not where I wanted to go." He nodded. No questions asked. People at stations like this know not to pry. He stood there for a moment, looked toward the tracks, and added, "Buses run here sometimes. Once a day." "I'm not waiting," she said quietly. "I wasn't going anywhere." He shrugged and walked away, leaving behind a trail of fuel oil and sweat. Clara walked out of the station gate. There was a path that started there, along the side of the road between a field and some bushes. Her bag was heavy, the strap digging into her shoulder, but walking was easier than standing. Standing meant waiting, and she had already waited long enough. Now she was just walking. The sun was beginning to rise. In the distance, beyond the copse, the silhouette of a lonely house loomed. It was wooden, with a moss-covered roof and a porch entwined with grapevines. Clara didn't know whose house it was, but her feet carried her there, not out of curiosity, out of exhaustion. She approached the gate. She knocked once, then again, quietly, as if she was afraid of waking someone who shouldn't be disturbed. And he came out. A man. About 60 years old, with a face that had seen too many winters. He looked at her for a long time, first at her, then at her bag, then at her hands. He didn't say anything. He just nodded toward the porch and went deeper into the house. Clara opened the gate. She went in, and for the first time in a long time she didn't ask permission. The house was warm inside. Not in the sense of coziness, but in the sense of the stove breathing in the corner. The smell of dry smoke, dusty wool, and bread filled her nostrils. Clara stopped at the threshold. It was a habit. Ever since childhood, someone else's threshold was like a border. Don't cross it unless you're invited. But here, it was as if she hadn't been turned away. They had simply left her some space. The man put 2 mugs on the table. Steam rose from the white ones. He sat down on a stool, took out a loaf of bread, and cut it in half. He put one half in front of her, without looking. Clara didn't sit down. She stood there as if she were taking an exam. Then she whispered, "I won't be long. Just need to rest a little. I'll leave in the morning." He nodded, as if he heard everything that was behind those words. "I'm not clinging to you. I'm not trying to get close to you. I'm not going to ruin anything. I'm just tired of being unwanted." She woke up under the blanket. She didn't remember how she had fallen asleep. The bed was low, the mattress worn, but for the first time in a long time, her body didn't ache from the cold. A cat was sitting on the windowsill, ginger, dignified. He looked at her suspiciously, as if checking to see if she was going to stay. The man, Matteo, as she learned a little later, was in the backyard. He was chopping wood. His movements were precise and unhurried. He didn't look in her direction. Clara went outside. She sat down on a bench, looking at the morning frost on the grass. "I'll leave," she said. "Just not now." Matteo didn't answer. He finished chopping, wiped his hands on his apron, and went into the house. A couple of minutes later, the smell of bread wafted through the window. She sighed and stayed. In the afternoon, she washed the dishes. She swept the porch. She found an old box of clothespins by the stove, sorted them, and stacked them neatly. She did it not because she had to, but because if she didn't, the voice in her head would start again. "You're sitting there like a burden again. All you do is consume. You're living in debt again." In the evening, Matteo put a bowl of soup on the table. He didn't say anything, yet he just put it there. And another bowl next to it. He sat down. He ate. She did too. They didn't speak the whole time. And yet this silence was different. Not like before. Not the silence of condemnation, but the silence of permission. For the first time, she felt that she could be silent, and not be afraid of being judged for it. But Clara didn't sleep that night. The nightmare wasn't about Elena. It wasn't about the train. It was about her staying. That she would like this place. And that then everything would go round in circles. "I'm always like this," she whispered in the dark. "I get used to things. Then they kick me out, or I leave myself." What's the point? The wind rattled the window frame. Water dripped somewhere. The house creaked with age. And Clara lay curled up, thinking, if I say thank you, I'll owe them. If I stay, I'll lose again. Maybe I should just leave now? But her legs wouldn't obey her. Neither would her heart. By morning, the house smelled of smoke and something sweet. Maybe bread crusts, maybe old wood. Clara stepped out onto the porch barefoot. The boards under her feet were rough, like life itself. Matteo was sitting on the step, drinking tea. In his hands was a mug, just like the one she had yesterday. Would you mind if I... Stayed another day? She asked quietly. He didn't turn around. He just nodded slightly, and that was enough to make everything inside her tighten. Not with joy, but with fear, because now she felt as if she had taken on a responsibility for herself, for this house, for not destroying another stranger's everything is fine. Clara began washing the windows, not because they were dirty, but because doing something with her hands was easier than talking to herself. Mateo silently handed her a rag. Then he went out to the backyard. She noticed how he checked each tool and stacked the firewood neatly, as if with a ruler, and suddenly she realized he lived here as if it were a refuge. Everything was under control. Everything was predictable. Her appearance was a crack in that perfection. And yet he didn't chase her away. In the evening, they sat by the stove. He sat on a low stool. She sat against the wall. The shadows from the flames danced across the ceiling like thoughts in her head. "Doesn't it bother you?" she asked suddenly. "What I'm doing here? What I just showed up." Mateo looked at her for the first time that day. "The mosquitoes annoy me." "People don't." Clara smiled uncertainly, the way people who have forgotten how to laugh properly do. She wanted to ask why he was like that, why he had let her in, but she knew that if she asked, she would ruin everything. Sometimes silence is a form of trust. That night, she stayed on the porch until late. She looked up at the sky. There were no stars, only thick fog, just like inside. She felt as if her sister was about to appear, or that the neighbor would come. They would say, "What are you doing here? This isn't your house." But no one came. For the first time, Clara felt that maybe staying wasn't a weakness. It was a choice, a conscious one, and a scary one. In the morning, she hung her clothes on a clothesline, swept the dust in the hallway, and cooked some porridge. Mateo sat down silently at the table. He ate. He nodded. Then he got up and left, as if everything was as usual. Clara watched him go. Her heart beat steadily, without a cry, without hope, just steadily. She stayed, not because she was asked to, but because for the first time in a long time, she felt that even though she was still a stranger, here she didn't have to apologize for being alive. He appeared suddenly, a boy of about 10, with protruding ears and a down jacket that was too big for him, tied around his waist like armor. He knocked on the door with his fist, without fear, as if he belonged there. Clara opened the door. He looked at her, squinting like a cat about to be caught. "Who are you?" he asked. His voice was hoarse, as if from a cold or constant screaming. "Clara," she replied. "And you?" "Thomas," he said, as if he had thrown a stone. "I'm here for Mateo. He has my eggs." Clara stepped aside. The boy walked into the house as if he lived there every Saturday. In the kitchen, he climbed onto a stool and took a jar out of his backpack. He put it on the table. He takes it, I bring it. He doesn't say thank you, I don't take offense. That's our deal. Clara smiled, sincerely, for the first time in... how long? Too long. "Do you come here often?" "Of course," Thomas shrugged. He doesn't yell. He doesn't ask questions. And he bakes bread like a wizard. He looked at her intently, as if deciding whether she was one of his or not. "Who are you to him?" Clara hesitated. Then she whispered, "No one." Thomas nodded, not surprised. "Well, for now. Here, everyone is nobody at first, but then... we'll see." From then on, Thomas came almost every day. Sometimes he brought eggs, sometimes he just sat at the doorstep. He carried a notebook with drawings, comics about a hero who saves a village from dullness. "This is Mateo," he said, showing her. He doesn't say anything. But when he bakes bread, everyone in the village's life gets better. Clara laughed. And it wasn't a polite laugh. It was real, with a twinkle in her eye, with breath. Once, the two of them were cleaning the yard of leaves. Thomas took a broom and started fighting invisible enemies with it. "You know," he said, "someone used to live with Mateo. Then they disappeared. Everyone thinks it was a woman, but he won't say anything. He hasn't even told me." Clara tensed up, but she didn't interrupt. "I think he likes you. He even started making coffee. He usually only makes tea." She didn't answer. Her eyes were fixed on the floor, but her heart was beating wildly. It was as if it had heard, "They can see you." Thomas brought an old book. He said, "Read it." "I don't feel like it myself. You're a good storyteller." Clara read. On the porch, amid the rustling leaves and the cat's occasional breathing, Thomas fell asleep to her voice, and on those evenings, Clara felt something thawing inside her. Not hope. A habit of being close and being needed. Sometimes he looked at her from under his eyelashes. "You're not like the others. Is that bad?" "I don't know. Just don't be afraid. He won't chase you away." Clara shook her head. "The problem isn't that he'll chase me away. It's that I don't believe I have the right to stay." Thomas shrugged. "Then stay until you believe it." And he left. His jacket hung behind him like a clumsy superhero's cape. She didn't know how much time had passed. A week, 2, more. The days went by without dates, without kicks, without screams, without the eternal "you're doing it wrong" again. Mornings were like any other morning. Porridge, silence, sometimes the cat at the door, then work, sweeping, washing, stacking firewood, repotting a flower. No one asked her to do it. She just wanted to. One day Clara found Mateo at the stove, kneading dough. His hands were covered in flour, his movements precise, as if they were tools rather than hands. "Will you teach me?" she asked. He looked away, as if he didn't understand the question. Then he nodded. He moved the bowl. And that was it. No words. Her first attempts were a mess, literally. The bread didn't rise. It burned and cracked. Clara was angry, but she didn't give up. Mateo only occasionally corrected her hand, or gestured, longer, more, slower. Not a single word of criticism. And that was perhaps the strangest thing, and the most painful. "I'm terrible at this," she said one day, looking at the soggy loaf. He shrugged. "Sometimes it's better to have one place than no place at all." Laughter filled the house. Not guffaws or merriment, just short, genuine moments. Thomas came home with stories. How he got into a fight with a boy. How he stole an apple and gave it back. How his aunt got a boyfriend, with a face like a piece of stale cheese. Clara listened, giggled, sometimes dropped dishes, because she had forgotten how to be carefree. They sewed a tablecloth together. Thomas drew his own coats of arms on the fabric, and she embroidered them with thread. It turned out funny. A lion here, a sun with crooked rays there, and an inscription. "Nothing here is perfect, but no one yells." Mateo was thawing in his own way, not with words, with actions. He fixed the door of the dresser in the room where she slept. He cleaned the mirror. He left a pair of warm socks in front of the door. Sometimes he spoke, not much, but precisely. "You're not shivering as much." "That's good." Clara nodded. She had noticed it too. Even her breathing had become more even. Once, when they were sitting on the porch, she said, "I don't remember the last time no one rushed me." Mateo smiled. "I don't remember the last time anyone was around." She looked at him deeply. Not with pity, but as a person who had finally seen himself in another. Clara began to tidy up the cupboards. She didn't ask permission. She just folded, cleaned, rearranged. Mateo didn't interfere. Sometimes he just watched her potter about and went out to the shed. There he worked on wood, without a word. It was as if he was carving not only the boards, but himself. They began to eat at the same table. Not opposite each other, but next to each other. It's more comfortable, they told themselves. But they both knew it was about something else. And yet, sometimes at night, Clara would wake up with the feeling that it was all a dream. That someone would come in and say, "What are you thinking? This isn't your home. This isn't your life." She didn't tell Mateo about this. She just stroked the cat. She breathed. She stared at the ceiling. And she whispered into the darkness, "Please, don't fall apart. Because these days, for the first time in a long time, there was something to lose." The morning began as usual. Clara put the kettle on and laid out the bread. Mateo repaired the handle on a drawer stubbornly, methodically. Thomas didn't come, but that didn't worry her. He had days like that. He would disappear and then come back as if nothing had happened. Clara went to the well to fetch water. On her way back, she saw a letter by the gate. A yellow envelope, slightly crumpled. No stamp. The handwriting was familiar. Elena. She didn't open it right away. She held it in her hands, fidgeted with the corner. Then she put it on the table and went out into the garden. 2 hours later, she returned. She opened it. She read it. The letter was short. The tone was the same as always. Not accusatory, but poisonous. No "how are you," no "take care." Just a list of insults, sharp as needles. "You ran away again. You didn't say anything again. We took you in, and you disappeared again. You're always like this. Silent, convenient, and then suddenly, slam." Even Daniil noticed. He said, "She's like an empty chair. She's there, but it's as if she's not. Don't expect me to open the door for you again. You chose this yourself. Live with it now." No signature, no period. Clara sat by the window. The letter lay on her lap. Her fingers trembled. Not from surprise, but from recognition. Again. Again, that feeling. You have no right to anger, to weakness, to choice. Even leaving is betrayal. Mateo entered quietly. He saw it. He stopped. "Problems?" Clara folded the letter in half. "No, everything's the same as always." He looked at her for a long time. Then he said, "When you lie, you squint your eyes. That's what children do when they're afraid they won't be believed." She smiled bitterly. "But I was really afraid." "Of what?" Clara looked at him, and for the first time she said aloud, "That I'm better off here, that I feel it, and that no one ever allowed me to feel it." That evening, she burned the letter. Behind the house, in an old barrel, the paper smoldered like a past life. She stared at the fire and felt not liberation, but emptiness. After dinner, they were silent. Thomas was not there. The cat did not come. The coals crackled in the stove. Mateo got up, took his mug, and asked, "What are you going to do tomorrow?" Clara shrugged. "Probably live." He nodded. "It's difficult, but it's worth a try." After the letter, the days became different. Not worse, more anxious. It was as if someone had appeared in the room, but invisible. The silence between her and Mateo grew deeper. He hadn't disappeared, no. He just started avoiding her gaze. In the evening, he would go to the barn. It used to seem normal to him, but now she felt it was an escape. Clara noticed that he had started sleeping on the old sofa by the stove again, instead of in his room. Sometimes he didn't even take off his shoes. She didn't ask. She understood. Men don't always run away with their feet. Sometimes they stay with their bodies, but their souls go far away. Thomas came on the third day, without the usual fuss. He sat down by the stove. He stared at the floor. "I heard in the village that you're one of those who give up," he said without looking up. "Who says that?" "Everyone. The old woman at the store. The guy with the goats. They say you're always somewhere, but you never stay anywhere. And that Mateo just lets you stay until he gets tired of you." Clara breathed quietly. She wasn't offended. There was nothing to be offended about. It just felt cold in her chest. Not because she had heard something new, but because she had heard something old, only in a different voice. In the evening, she washed the floor, until it squeaked. She wasn't washing away dirt. She was washing away panic. She wiped her hands on a rag. Mateo came back, dirty, covered in sawdust. He took off his jacket and sat down. He didn't look at her. She brought him tea. "Am I bothering you?" Clara asked. "No." "Then why did you start sleeping on the sofa?" He was silent for a long time. Then he said, "Because I'm used to it, alone. I'm not waiting for anyone. I'm not waiting. Not for a long time. What if someone comes? Then they have to decide for themselves whether to stay or go." She lowered her eyes. She understood. He wasn't chasing her away, but he wasn't keeping her either, and she wanted to be kept. From that night on, she started packing her bag again. Not openly, slowly. She put things just in case in her bag. Spare socks, a scarf, herbal tea. She checked the lock on the bag, just because. Not because she was leaving, but so she would have somewhere to go if they told her to leave. Her heart was pounding not in her chest, but in her ears, loudly, as if to remind her, "You're still a stranger here. You've allowed yourself too much." On the fourth day, Mateo said, "I have to go to town tomorrow, for a couple of days. For flour, for iron. Will you stay?" Clara nodded, but inside she felt the ground crack beneath her feet. The ice she had been standing on all this time began to melt. When Mateo left, the house was completely different. The same table, the same cups, the cat sleeping in the same place. But everything seemed to have shrunk inward. The silence rang like a blow. Even the bread on the table remained unsalted. Clara sat on the porch in the coat she wore on the coldest days. It was warm, but inside it felt like February. Her hands were shaking, not from the cold, from a premonition. Now it would all end. Not loudly, not with a scandal, just like the singing of a kettle when the stove is turned off. She went to the closet, opened it, took out a bag, laid it out on the bed, slowly, almost tenderly, like a woman who had not been touched for a long time. She began to pack her things: underwear, a scarf, a book Thomas had been reading, an embroidered tablecloth, the one they had sewn together. Then she stopped, sat down, and just stared at it all. How many times had she packed? How many times had she left? And still, nothing had changed. She tore up the piece of paper on which she had written a list of things she needed to do, not out of anger, out of futility. Because no amount of doing things can save you when you're like a folding chair in a house. You seem to be needed, but only as long as you're not in the way. In the evening, she tried to bake bread, the same bread Mateo had taught her to make. It didn't work. The crust burned and the crumb didn't rise. She sat down by the stove, hugging her knees, and watched the smoke rise. The smoke smelled like smoke. Her shame. "You don't belong," whispered an inner voice. You never did. The next morning, she saw Thomas at the porch. He stood there, embarrassed. In his hands was a box of eggs. He didn't come in. He just said, I heard you're leaving again. Clara looked at him. She smiled, barely. I'm not going. I can't not go anymore. He nodded. He put the box by the door and walked away. He didn't even turn around. That night, she sat in the kitchen. In front of her was a cup, just like when she first arrived. There was another one across from her, but now there was no hope behind that chair. Only a shadow. And memories. Clara picked up the second cup and carried it to the sink. She dropped it on the way. The ceramic broke into 2 pieces, almost perfectly. It was as if even the cup knew that they were no longer a pair. All that was left were shards and an empty chair. That night, she dreamed of her childhood home, where she and Elena shared a room and a tapestry with deer hung on the wall. In her dream, her mother put soup in front of her and said, Eat faster, don't linger, or you'll get in the way again. And Clara ate. She swallowed, choked, just to get away from the table as quickly as possible. She woke up in the dark with a taste in her throat as bitter as unspoken words. The stove had gone cold. The wind was blowing against something outside the window. The cat was curled up in her place. She sat on the bed in her nightgown and stared into space. What have I become? Flashed through her mind. There was no one else in the house, but her thoughts would not let her be. She remembered how, when she was 7, she had brought home a wounded bird. Her mother had shouted, Get it out of here! We don't need a dead bird! Clara had gone out into the yard. She had wrapped the sparrow's leg in thread and put it in a box with cotton wool. The bird died. But then she understood for the first time that not everyone wants to be saved, and not everyone needs to be saved. Since then, Clara had carried everyone on her shoulders. Old women, cats, other people's children, perpetually tired men. She saved them until she herself began to drown. And when she drowned, they called her weak, soft, a failure. You failed. It was like a sentence. She went out onto the porch. She sat down on the same step where Mateo had sat before. The cold penetrated her bones. But she didn't care. She looked at the dark field as if it were a mirror. Why are you alive? To be useful, so that you won't be driven away, so that you have somewhere to return to when there's nowhere else to go. And suddenly, another question. Quiet. Almost childish. Can you just be? Without being useful. Without fear. Without humiliation. The tears didn't come right away. At first, her chest just tightened, then her hands. Then it became difficult to breathe. And then everything poured out of her, in a voice, in sobs, in whispers. It was as if what she had buried all her life was rising from the ground. I'm afraid to be myself because no one loves me like this. She didn't pray. She didn't ask for anything. She just sat there. Until the sun rose. Light fell on the field, on the roof of the house, on the path to the gate. And in that silence, it suddenly became clear. She no longer wanted to be a ghost. She didn't want to prove anything. She didn't want to beg. She wanted to be. She got up early in the morning. Her body ached from the cold and tension, but it felt light, as if something heavy had been lifted from it. Clara went to the mirror. She looked at herself. She didn't look for pimples, didn't fix her hair, didn't suck in her stomach. She just looked. With a face that wasn't trying to please, with eyes that weren't waiting to be appreciated. She lit the stove. She drew some water. She put the dough on to rise. She did everything slowly, with an unfamiliar tenderness, as if every little thing was saying, You can be here simply because you are. When she finished kneading the dough, she noticed that her fingers were shaking again. It wasn't fear, it was a reflex. Someone will come in now and say, "Who are you?" But no one came in. She put the tablecloth on the table, the one she had sewn with Thomas. She smoothed out the corners. Then she set out 2 cups, not out of obligation, but because she wanted to. Closer to lunchtime, the gate creaked. Thomas appeared on the path. He walked as usual, unhurried, with his backpack and his usual expression of, "I was just passing by, but suddenly someone might be alive." "Hello," he said. "Hello," Clara replied. "You look different today. Did you eat someone?" She smiled, shook her head. "I just stopped hiding." He nodded as if he understood. He took an apple out of his backpack, took a bite, and sat down on the doorstep, silently. "Is Mateo back yet?" he asked later. "No. But now I'm not afraid he won't come back." "Why?" "Because even if he doesn't, I'm staying here anyway." That evening, Clara took an old knitted blanket out of the chest of drawers. She mended a corner. She hung the laundry out to dry. She sorted through the herbs. She brewed some linden tea for herself. There was a piece of paper on the table. She sat down. She began to write a letter. Not to her sister, to herself. To the person she had left behind many years ago. "You deserve to live. Not for anyone else. Not with anyone else's permission. But because you are alive." She signed it, Clara, and smiled. No patronymic. No foreign surnames. Just her name. Just her. Mateo returned at sunset. Quietly. Just as he had left. The wooden gate creaked, and Clara, wiping her hands on her apron, came out onto the porch. He was carrying a bag of flour, which he silently placed against the wall and dusted off his palms. He didn't look at her. He didn't look for her. "I baked bread," she said. "It didn't turn out great, but it didn't burn." He nodded. "That's good." They went into the house. Mateo hung up his jacket and poured water into the kettle. Everything was as usual. Only the air had become thick, like before a storm. Clara set the cups on the table. She sat down. She looked at him until he sat down opposite her. "I got a letter," she began. He looked up. He didn't interrupt. "From Elena. She wrote that I'm disappearing again, that I'm unnecessary, that even the child doesn't notice me, and I wanted to write back, to tell her that she's cruel, that I'm tired, that I can't take it anymore. But then I realized I don't need to explain anything to her." Mateo frowned slightly, but remained silent. "Everything I tried to earn, a home, love, a place at the table, I begged for as a favor. And now, I'm not asking for anything. I'm just living here. Not as a guest, not as a mistake, as a human being." Silence. Only raindrops outside the window. He put down his cup and looked at her face. "I didn't hold you back, but I didn't chase you away either." "I know. But I've been chasing myself away my whole life." Mateo sighed quietly. Then he reached out his hand. Awkwardly. Like a man who had long since forgotten how to touch another person's skin. "Stay," he said, without pressure, almost in a whisper. "If you want to. Not for me, for yourself." Clara placed her hand on top of his, quietly, as if it were not a touch, but a vow. "I've already stayed." That evening, they ate bread with bitter cheese. They laughed at how Thomas had drawn a three-eyed cat on their tablecloth. He appeared after dinner with a handful of chestnuts and a look that said, "How could you leave me out?" They sat him between them. They fed him, listened to his stories, and for the first time in many years, Clara didn't count her words. She wasn't afraid of saying the wrong thing. In this simplicity, there was everything. The end. No fanfare, no victories, just presence. Just honesty. The morning was ordinary. The stove was smoldering and the room smelled of bread. Clara washed the floor. She set the table. 2 cups, as always, but now there was no emptiness between them. There was no need to pretend that someone was sitting opposite her. Someone was there. Mateo cut the bread, silently, carefully. Then he put a slice on her plate. She took it with her fingers, without fear, without apology. Just like someone who could. The cat was sitting on the windowsill, the same one, but now he wasn't wary. He was full, asleep. There was something symbolic about it, as if everything that had been wounded had finally allowed itself to close its eyes. Outside, the day was beginning. Gray, with raindrops on the glass. But Clara was no longer waiting for clear skies. She knew that rain doesn't make a house cold if it's warm inside. There was a letter on the dresser, unopened, from Elena. She had brought it a couple of days ago, not daring to come in. Clara left the envelope untouched, not out of indifference, but because she had already said everything, for the first time, to herself. She took the embroidered tablecloth and spread it on the table. It had crooked suns, funny lions, and an inscription that Thomas had come up with. Nothing here is perfect, but no one yells. Clara smiled, and then she just sat down at the table, where her chair now stood. If you've ever felt like a stranger in your own home, write the word home in the comments. Let's see how many of us there are. Those who are learning to build a place for themselves from scratch.